George, we would like to ask you to introduce yourself and to tell us how your ideas developed along with your development as an activist. So can you give us a bit of an introduction to that?
Sure. I come from a generation of the 1960s in the United States. And my first experience of struggle was to be found in the civil rights movement of the early 60s. I was a student in the universities at that time, and I went on many demonstrations, especially for the rights of African Americans. Because there was I think it would be important for us to say that the 60s movement experienced a revolution, actually, within the United States. It's an unfinished revolution because the demands that were put forward have legally been approved, but in actual fact, there's still a substantial struggle to be made. And for me, it was the beginning where I got arrested a number of times around demonstration issues, and I was able to study the first experiences of organization, both in in New York City, where I was born and brought up, and in Ohio, and in fact in southern Ohio, which was more or less a segregated place. And well, from that beginning, I immediately went into the anti-war, Vietnamese War story. And it was there that I began to look for some theoretical basis for my activism. And it was a time in the mid-60s when there was a revival of Marxism. And here is something I'd like to say something about, because there's a certain kind of determinism about past experiences that is not accurate. Because in the 1950s, preceding the revolutionary upsurge in the United States, it was one of the most reactionary times in American history. And everybody predicted that the students who were going through high school and college at that time would come out to be robots, right-wing robots, speaking the reactionary lines. But in fact, it turned to be the exact opposite. At least, not only I, but so many, literally millions of young folks who have been told that McCarthy is a great guy and that the capitalism is the best way to organize society. These young people who came out of the colleges and universities at that time did not end up becoming these little right-wing robots. On the contrary, we joined the revolutionary movement in the southern part of the United States, and not only the southern part, but actually throughout the country, to demand that there be fundamental change. And so as a consequence, I began to study with comrades the works of revolutionaries before us, and I at that time became part of study groups which were very much part of the education of young activists and militants. And it was in that route that I began to develop my ideas. It's a long story, but maybe hopefully I gave you some sense of what happens in the 1960s that eventually led to the kind of politics that I ended up with and still adhere to.
Maybe you can talk a little bit also about the encounter more with also some Italian, the work on zero work, and the encounter with some of the theories that were coming out of Italy in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s.
Yes, I can talk about it because it was a very important part of my... because what happened was that the kind of theory that I begin to develop with others in the late 60s, early 70s was a very orthodox, if you want to call it that, Marxism of the time. And I began to, in the early 70s, I began to question some of the principal ideas that were coming out of the communist movements and the socialist movements of the time. And I began to look for other sources of theoretical depth. And to do that, I came upon the work of Silvia and a number of other comrades from Italy that had found their way to New York City and who were part of the radical scene of the 1970s. And their way of interpreting Marx struck me as making a lot of sense. Because what happened was that in the 1960s in Italy, there was an attempt to create an understanding of Marxism that begins to look at the working class not as a fixed and given entity, but actually was
a dependent variable of development. That was the word, not as a dependent variable of development.
And in the process, in studying this non-dependent and autonomous conception of the working class, we began to also enter into the development of some important ideas in the Wages for Housework campaign. So, if you want to put it this way, if we're going to kind of shake things out, the political thinking that affected me at this time was a combination of the workerist interpretation of Marx in the 1960s that came from Italy, and the work of Silvia
and
others around the Wages for Housework campaign that brought together to the first theoretical break of that time for me which was the development of the ideas around zero work, which attempted to bring wages for housework and the workerist streams that were developing at this time. And so this leads to my the point of my own development that is much more continuous.
So we would like to ask you about your concept of work/energy. You insist in keeping these two words or these two concepts together. Can you explain us that? What are you aiming at by keeping these two ideas together?
Well, the ideas of the work energy, work/energy, was developed by comrades and myself in the early 1980s to first deal with the notion of an energy crisis. I and others in my group that had formed in the journal of the Midnight Notes would be responding to the attempt to understand the crisis of the late 70s as a result of an energy crisis. And so we felt that that was not an adequate way of understanding the situation. We were looking at an attempt to bring together the notions of Marxism with the theoretical developments of the workerist and the Wages for Housework campaign. Bring them all together and develop a conception of what the crisis is, was involving not energy, because energy as a physical quality was endless, but the crisis of the 1980s that capitalism was facing involved a work crisis, the ability to use energy to extract surplus value from the working class of the time. And as a consequence, it was not a crisis of energy, but a crisis of how much work could be gotten from a particular type of arrangement of energy production. And this began a process of re-understanding what was a very important characteristic of capitalism, which is that if the work that can be developed out of a particular energy structure begins to fall, if that ratio becomes less and less
Profitable.
yeah, profitable, then there would be a crisis of a serious nature, which would require a change in the energy foundations of a work regime which capitalism needs to use to replace an older relationship between energy and work. So, for example, the transition from coal to oil as being the central kinds of energy that are being used, when coal miners around the world began to become rejection of capitalism, which was increasingly beginning to appear, then the shift from coal to oil was pushed ahead to create a new relationship between energy and work. And we began to look at the various kinds of transitions that have occurred and the other kinds of transitions that didn't occur. So, for example, the energy crisis of going from coal to oil was a successful one, and far from over, by the way. But the transition that was supposed to take place...
From a capitalist viewpoint.
Yeah, indeed. But I would say that the assumption that there would be another transition from oil to nuclear power has not been successfully concluded. And it was very important for us to point out that if you want to understand the crises that are taking place in the 20th centuries, you have to see them as transitions to different kinds of relationships between energy and work.
So could you say that another way of putting it is showing that the whole issue of energy is connected with class struggling in terms of more traditional terms, that you can understand the so-called energy crisis without connecting it to a whole process of struggles that are central in determining the crisis.
Yes, as usual, Silvia, you put your finger on an excellent way of describing.
Well, I've read your work.
Okay, so there's a lot of there's a lot of work that has come out of this energetic connection. So it would be the beginning of understanding. I think it's a very rich concept, and it's only now that it's beginning to be understood, I think. And you're beginning to see the notion of work energy as being used more often. So I hope this helps.
Yeah. In relation to that, we would like to ask you about the notion of refusal of work and how it relates to valorization, creation of value. In particular, part of your work is on machines and how relative surplus value is a result of a previous struggle against absolute surplus value. What's the place of the refusal of work in the creation of value in capital? If you can elaborate on that and how it relates to machines and the different generations of machines.
Well, let's see. The most important first response is to point out that work is not work for capitalism is not a natural state of being. That when you look at capitalism and its roughly 500 years of history, you see class struggle continually finding itself revealed in many different guises, and having many different forms. So, for example, there is an important refusal of work that takes place in the conditions under which capitalism was involved with extensive slavery. It was also important to understand that the struggle against slavery was not only the product of some gentleman in London working with the Parliament, but the slave rebellions which took place all over the planet in the 18th and 19th, early 19th centuries, that was the basis of the end of formal slavery. And this point is very important. First, for just getting your orientation in history, of beginning to understand why things happen, why capitalism changes, is because, and this is the refusal of work, that you don't understand fundamental changes in capitalism unless you see them as responses to important changes within the working class itself. And this is not this very simple methodological point is now beginning to be taken seriously by many scholars of capitalism. So, but then there's the point about the relationship between refusal of work and the way it gets expressed in I'm trying to find that if you want to understand what the value of work comes from, it has its deep roots in the ability of workers to say no. That's an essential part of the value-producing valorization process.
Can you explain that? In what way saying no produces value? In what sense? Like, can you go elaborate that a little bit more?
It's only when capitalism faces the fact that work is not an automatic process, that it begins to value. It's only when workers begin to be able to say no to work that the work itself becomes valuable. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think it's an important point methodologically. And it gives a sense of what it is to create value. What is essential about the creation of value is not that it's you create beautiful things or useful things, but that you are able to see that the production process is being run by beings who can say no to the production process. If that was not there, then work would become totally machine production. And the difference between machines and human beings would be lost. So the refusal of work, getting back to, becomes an essential part of the valorization process.
Of the degree to which labor, the process of exploitation, it's organized.
Yes. And I think it's an important, for me it changed my understanding. There's here's a couple of steps here. One is that one of the famous insights that we get from reading Marx is that we begin to see human labor behind the commodity form. And the value of the commodities coming from human labor. And that changes everything. We begin to understand why there's a particular screw that takes place that's being used to keep this piece of machinery stable. And I'm just using this as a just throwaway. Everything was decided by somebody to say that the screw goes clockwise instead of counterclockwise. Right? And that insight is more than enough for many to say, wow, this world is that surrounds us with all the little different aspects of life. And we see that's one of the great contributions in Marxism to our understanding of class struggle. But then there's another part that it's not that Marx was not understanding of it, but did not make it central to his analysis, which was and is the part that not only is the decision to make that particular screw go clockwise, but also the ability of the workers and the designers of this particular piece of machinery who are able to say no to the process of this labor that takes place and that puts into action the forging of this particular little piece of machinery.
Which then requires a whole area, a whole regime of organization of work, of exploitation, etc.
It's a side of things that also is exciting. So in my post-Orthodox Marxism situation, I began to have two conceptual revolutions, one in the early 70s, where I began to study Marxism and what's called the labor theory of value. And then add to that labor theory of value the ability for workers to refuse to work. And this opens up another question, which has to do with the development of machines, yes, and the recognition that machinery is if we want to understand where they come in, has to do with the response to workers' struggles. These struggles are what make things change and lead to changes in machinery and also the energy that drives these machines. And they come in response to refusal of work, which is a way of speaking about class struggle that brings out the elements, the essential elements of capitalism and what we describe as the class struggle.
Okay, thanks.
next question we have is about a concept that in some way it puzzled us when reading it because it's difficult to translate into Spanish. The idea of the manifold of work that you talk about in at least in two of your books. So we would like to know what do you mean by manifold of work? What's the relationship between the different kinds of work and this sort of form of funneling work towards capitalist accumulation?
Yes, the manifold of work is a term that I'm not sure who exactly used it first, but there's a point behind it, which is to say that work that is essential for understanding capitalism and the class struggle is not something that takes place alone in a factory. There's not one form of work. And this conception of work that we developed in the early 1980s, we called manifold of work, is the fact that much work takes place in areas where the word work was never used to. And so, for example, much of the work that is involved in the reproduction of workers, and this is a point that Silvia's made.
No, not Silvia, the women's movement.
The women's Silvia through the women's movement, yeah.
Yes, Silvia through the women's movement. And others, Silvia and others through the women's movement. Yeah.
Pace.
See.
Yes.
And also cognitive work, for example, the work of cognition, etc., which has usually traditionally been more recognized.
Yeah,
but it has,
work,
yes, student work, exactly. Yeah. In fact, George was very involved in a whole struggle about wages for students.
Yes.
Saying, and in Italy too, there was a whole movement, presalario, right, saying studying is work. Because we don't study because we like it, but you're forcing us to take a degree in order to become more productive workers. So we are working already in preparing ourselves for future work. So we should be entitled to remuneration and to be supported economically. And it's been a big defeat in the United States when in fact they have forced students to pay. It's like paying, to prepare yourself to be exploited or to prepare yourself to be more productive. So yeah, the work has many, but I think it's important this concept that the manifold refers to forms of work that were never recognized as work.
Yes, and it's the most important example is the reproductive work that takes place in preparing workers both generationally and daily to return to work. And it's very much a manifold. It has many different forms of work, and that we begin to expand in the 1970s and into the 80s, so that we begin, for example, to see that there's a tremendous amount of work that takes place. In fact, most of the work of the planet takes place in trying to in creating a new generation of workers. And
sex work, emotional work.
This,
raising of children, all of that. It's a vast area of work. I think that the women's movement has really contributed immensely to showing the manifold of work
but it also helps explain the relationship between work that creates value in the upper levels of capital and in the lower levels, like the higher composition, like organic composition, and the lower
The
organic
transfer,
composition.
yeah, maybe you can talk about that.
Maybe,
Yes.
would it be interesting if you can explain how there's a sentence that I can never forget, that you write something like, in order to have a cyborg, we need a slave.
Mm.
So
Right.
I think that's an interesting idea. Like, if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, the high level, the sectors of high level exploitation suck up from what you call the transfer problem.
Yes, there's one of the things that I myself begin to take seriously after recognizing that there's been a tremendous hidden work that takes place and is not used and is not referred to as work, as, for example, the work that goes into bringing up a child, for example. So we began to see that the formal work that is presented as real work is waged work that is openly recognized by workers and capitalists in often legal, there are laws that tell us what is legally considered work or not. Whereas in fact there's a tremendous amount of work that is not understood as work, but in fact is essential for the creation of surplus value. Okay, now here, hold on to your hats, and here we go to the very important, I think, use that the concept of organic composition can be used to understand the nature of capitalism and why capitalism is such a subtle system where so much is hidden from us, so much is a matter of transformation. In fact, at this time, at the time of the writing of Capital by Marx, I counted there were 23 chapter titles that include the notion of transformation, of which, of course, the transformation of value into prices is the most well-known one. But if you open up a volume of Capital, Volume 1, you'd see that there's a tremendous number of other uses of the term transformation. And it's this transformation that creates a level of hiddenness in the system, so that if you try to follow where this particular work takes place and how its value is created and where it ends up in the system, you see it's not an easy process. It's not a direct process. Most commodities have value that is not equivalent to the amount of labor that goes into the production of that commodity.
Mm.
And it's very important to say, to look into where does it go, because it's this fact that makes it difficult for us to understand where the particular form of labor that goes into the production of commodity gets transformed into other parts of the system. And a simple way of understanding that is by using the classic Marxist conception of organic composition, of constant capital, which is a technical way of saying that if you want to understand machines, if you want to understand the capitalist system as a whole, you have to see that the commodities that are being produced with a lot of machinery and very little human labor, as you can see in, for example, in the platforms that are used for the extraction of oil from the oceans. When we see that 20 or 30 men and a few women would work in a platform that is used for extracting oil in the sub-ocean localities, have a very high organic composition, whereas the work of, for example, the workers in the coal mines of Britain in the time of Marx would have a very low organic composition.
Can I maybe use this example to nail down the concept? Because it seems to me that, you know, in your work, you have used over and over the way oil companies, the whole oil industry, extractive, it's accumulating surplus, right? It's in fact been one of the richest enterprises, capitalist enterprises in the planet. It's accumulating. Is a good example of this transfer, right? Because it employs very few workers. And so in many ways it's a kind of an enigma how they're accumulating so much surplus if they actually employ, relatively speaking, very few workers. Whereas I think much of your work has shown that yes, because of this transfer, that labor is in capitalism is often transferred from sectors with a very low level of technological development into the sectors who have a higher level of technological development, which basically have the capacity to extract and to force this transfer. So that, for example, the oil companies accumulate an immense amount of value, not because of the labor on the platform, on the oil rig, but accumulate the labor and the surplus value from all the people who are paying for electricity bills, who every time, for instance, there is an increase, they have to work more to pay for the new gas bill, electricity bill, etc., etc. So they have millions of little spots, you know, a little restaurant, a little kitchen, with a very low level of, and yet, nevertheless, you know, I mean, you've talked many times that we are all the oil workers proletariat. That the oil workers proletariat is not only the people who are working on the rigs, because we are all paying all our labor insofar as we are paying gas bills, electricity bill, all of this. We are all contributing to the accumulation of the oil companies. And this again shows that, you know, the point you were making now, that in capitalism, it's very deceptive where the surplus value is coming from. It doesn't necessarily come right? From the labor that produces a particular commodity immediately, right? But behind the labor that produces this commodity, there is a whole other, yeah, which also, in my view, I mean, I've thought about, I've applied that concept also to the question of housework, for instance, that the accumulation of surplus value in any particular place of work. It's not dependent only on the labor that is done by those particular workers, but it's dependent also by the reproductive work that is done in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the communities, etc., in the schools. And so that we tend to have a very mechanical view of the way capitalism accumulates wealth and value. That in fact it's much more complicated, and it's not so localized. And that's why, in a way, the struggle, it's a struggle that really it's more and more difficult to win, by when it is localized. Yeah. But anyway, I didn't.
As usual.
Yeah. No, but when you talk about high organic composition, I think it's also, there is something in Marx that the sectors with higher level of organic composition have this capacity to suck, to draw labor from other sectors. That's why, then in order to have a nuclear worker, you need to have a slave. In order to have an industrial worker, you need to have. And that's also very, very interesting, because then the whole question of hierarchies and ideologies that are justifying a hierarchical, right? You can see like racism and sexism as also ways of hiding, right?
This transfer.
Hiding those transfers, yes, as ways not only of keeping people divided, creating antagonism, etc., but also as part of a machinery of hiding, of occultation. Okay. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
All right. We're speaking in yes.
I think that. This is well put, and I think that it's important for us to understand this point for all sorts of struggles. And to look at the kind of alliances that are possible.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Instead of beginning to look at, this is my work and I'll struggle around this particular piece of the pie, without recognizing that there's actually a much larger struggle that the capitalists are fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very important that we understand and be able to integrate pieces of Marxism with other parts, other ways, and new concepts that are important, and that we can begin to integrate into the 21st century, because it took a little time it took about 40 years, I think, for these ideas to begin to enter into the mainstream. And now, I mean, even our gathering here this morning is an example of the increasing interest in these ideas, and hopefully, at least I have the hope.
Yeah. No, but I mean, there's a new understanding that coloniality, racism, sexism are not, then it's not like, what is the relation with the class struggle, which has been the traditional conception, right? As if they were outside of it, as if they had nothing to do with exploitation of labor and were something else, right? And now that in fact coloniality, for example, as an essential structural dimension of capitalism, or racism being and unpaid labor, slave labor, forced labor being all essential structural elements of capitalism. That I think is becoming much more part of the general discourse. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So our next question is in relation to the category of neoliberalism. You don't use much this category. We would like to, if you can explain us why. Well, are you not interested in talking about neoliberalism, or you have other ways of explaining the same phenomenon that probably add some more nuances to the problem, to explaining the problem?
Well, it's not that I'm not interested in this notion, but I wanted to, I've dealt with the notion of neoliberalism under a different title, which is capitalism. In other words, as far as I understand what neoliberalism is the attempt to totalize the concepts of the liberal tradition of the 18th century and 19th centuries. It was the attempt to presumably say that commodities ought to be freely exchanged, but there were limits as to what could be freely exchanged. And what neoliberalism, as far as I understand it, is an attempt to totalize. Is to say that all forms of transactions are really commodity transactions, so that the state operates as a purveyor of particular kinds of commodities. And that, in a way, what neoliberalism is about is to say that all forms of social interactions are basically commodities. And
mercenaries.
Mercenary. Yeah, it's commodities, but so there's this a similarity between the concept of neoliberalism with the notions that we developed, but with a very different meaning and a very different consequence. Capitalism is neoliberalism, and that's why, in a way, it's not been our...
is a totalizing capitalism.
Yeah.
And also the concept of the new enclosure, it's also part of that. It's been part of the categories that has been used to describe this new form, this new phase of capitalism. Whereas generally the accent is placed on neoliberalism, also this new phase, also you and also I've been used a lot the notion of the new enclosure.
Yes. Yes, that's a very important part of the way in which we've developed concepts in the 1990s. And it's important for us to understand it because we see that there's a relationship between the development of the expulsion of people from the means of production and the means of reproduction as an essential part of the creation of a society in which all forms of life are commodified.
Right. Yeah, we could talk about enclosure of also
And
not only lands, but enclosure of social relation, urban spaces,
So-
bodies, etc.
so this has been a way in which we've been, another way of describing the class struggle. Because on the one side is a commodification that is called neoliberalism. And on the other side, we developed the notion of the commons as being the what in fact is being struggled over. This is a very, I think it's been a useful way of understanding the way class struggle operates. And
The new forms of antagonism and the new forms of changing social relations.
and as a consequence also the struggles around the commons, because we hearken back to the origins of capitalism. Now we use a term that Marx uses, but in a different and more generalized fashion, of the new enclosures.
So our next question was precisely about commons and enclosures. Maybe we can divide the question in two parts. First, we would like to ask you about the history of this discussion, because Marx talks about the legislation of that begins to create enclosures in Britain and elsewhere in the first volume of Capital. There's the discussion of primitive accumulation in the Grundrisse. We would like to ask you how this discussion reappears or resurfaces in the 80s or around the 80s, and because it is a very important point in your work, and also in the work of Silvia and Peter Linebaugh, other people that are related to you. So we would like to ask you how it reappears after so many years. And also the second part of the question would be, how can we relate today, this is more of a what is to be done question, how can we relate today the struggle for higher wages or working class struggles to the struggles for both keeping the commons and commoning, like creating new commons? More so, that you in somewhere you say that one way, that a way of relating these two struggles could be finding alliances between working class struggles and the community and solidarity economics, like the economics based on cooperatives or different sorts of commons. More so, taking into account that this is a dispute with the way capital leads consumerism towards the big brands and to other kinds of like away from this commons-based economics. So how the first question the first part of the question is a little bit of history of the commons enclosures discussion, and the second part would be how to how can we use this struggle for the commons and in relation to class struggle, other forms of class struggle.
Okay. Let me just say that the concept of primitive accumulation, it's not exactly a Marxist concept. Marx says that this is a concept that was developed by Adam Smith, and it involved a particular kind of accumulation of capital that took place in order to satisfy the essential conditions for the development of capitalism. And Marx develops the notion of primitive accumulation to point out that this process of satisfying the initial conditions for the creation of a capitalist society is rooted in tremendous violence that took place in Britain in the 18th century, and basically was a way in which the means of production were taken away from the agricultural proletariat of the previous historical period. And instead of talking about enclosures and of the time of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was discussed as a form of satisfying the conditions for capitalism to take off. The claim is that it was a one-time affair. It happened once, capitalism was shaped, and primitive accumulation is done for. What we did is to say that the process of primitive accumulation, the violence that goes into it, is an ongoing process. And there's been a big debate about this in different venues in this last 20 years or so. And what I and others have said is that whenever capitalism enters into a crisis, there is a period of primitive accumulation, because the crises are usually the result of efforts by the working class, and successful efforts, to reduce the commodification of their lives. And as a consequence, the new enclosures are forever, as long as capitalism exists, there's always a moment of primitive accumulation to deal with the crisis. See, and so what we're saying, and we use these terms to harken back to the earlier phase of capitalism, and to say that capitalism never loses its youth, you might say.
And I would add that we use those terms also because starting in the 80s, we almost saw it developing under our own eyes. You know, yeah, both George and I were in Africa, for example. I mean, George much longer than I, but we saw, you know, in the early 80s, the beginning, you know, as a response to the so-called debt crisis, we saw a whole attack coming from the World Bank and the FMI, the International Monetary Fund, against communitarian relation, communal forms of land property in different parts of Africa, the whole this big drive to privatizing. Then in the 90s, Latin America, the Zapatista struggle, also both the attack on the commons that come with the neoliberalism, with the 19, the structural adjustment. Part of the, you know, the organization of structural adjustment was the idea of putting an end, legally and with violence, to communal forms of land property. And then the response, the struggle of indigenous people. It's not an accident in the 90s. You have a whole intensification of struggle. The Zapatistas. I think the Zapatistas also brought the idea of the commons into into a much broader world movement, right? Into the social movement. The anti-globalization movement, I think, was very much affected. And also, I think in the 90s you have, on the other hand of the discourse on the commons, because all new theories coming from Italian autonomies, the Negri, Hart, about the digital commons, about the internet, and to be in new forms, of cooperative, work, reconstituting new forms of communitarianism on another level. So you had the digital commons, the land commons, and I've been also doing work around the question of common in reproduction, the work itself, not only in terms of recuperating land, but also in terms of creating new forms of, which also was inspired by things that have been happening in Latin America, the comedores populares. So it's, I think, the discussion of the commons is coming from two sides. That on one side, the attack on communitarian relation, starting in the 80s, late 70s, and continuing through the present. And the other, the new forms of struggle that have been developing, right? By the defense of communal lands, and the defense and the creation, not only the defense of communal land, but also the creation of new forms of reproduction. I think this is, which I think is really one of the most important things that is happening.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think we're at a particular moment in the story of the class struggle, which is very decisive, because through all this rigmarole about Trump and Johnson, Bolsonaro and all this, is that what's not seen is the fact that capitalism itself is facing a very serious profits crisis. When interest rates reach negative levels, when growth rates reach negative levels, together, we are looking at a system that is not on its own terms. We don't have to wait for George Caffentzis to say, you've got a problem. This is a period when, in fact, it's exactly because there is this crisis that we have a Trump, not the other way around. So I think that at least in this particular moment, we have a serious consequence of the operation of this system.
An opportunity, because I think that in a way, if you recognize that, you also recognize that the alternative, struggling and hoping that there's going to be a capitalism with a human face, right? The idea of a kind of a capitalism that can implement reforms, that can humanize exploitation. It's very much an illusion. And that the question of beginning to organize it in ways that presumes that we have to move, that we have to change the system. They begin to organize along those lines, then it becomes, life and death matter. A matter of, because, the option of a reformist capitalism at this point, I think it's out of the question. That's at least where we both in different ways come from.
one last question. We've been talking about primitive accumulation, class struggle, refusal of work, crisis of capitalism in these years, commoning, manifold of work, and you've been saying about Bolsonaro and Trump as an expression of actual crisis of capitalism. So what is your reflection or your thoughts on another form of expression, of political expression nowadays in the States, on the Green New Deal, on the proposal of these socialist young Americans, about the transformation or fair transition, just transition that is emerging also from the union sector. Maybe some opinion more on these days, on the present days.
Okay. The two parts of the question, one having to deal with...
Can you look at me, please?
Okay, look at... All right.
You can answer here.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. The part of the question that deals with the new enclosures is something that I think is very... the choice of terms is not an innocent process, of course. And the reason why the notion of a new enclosures is used is to bring about the recognition that there's a solidarity between the struggles of today and the struggles against capitalism before it had formed itself, and that there was a notion that there were many struggles against capitalism before there was even capitalism. I think this is an important point that should be understood, because it also lays the foundations for something else. See, the idea that we can find an alternative to capitalism is when we speak of the new enclosures, we speak not only of capitalism having to destroy the means of the access of workers to the means of production, is very much a recognition that there has been a long-term struggle to repress the initial conditions of capitalism to exist. So as a consequence, this terminology, this terminological dispute is important, because I think it really brings out the fact that that capitalism is not some natural product of historical transformation, but that it has been repressed for many centuries, and that there have been various efforts over the history.
Or it's been more than repressed. Yeah, it's been the attempt to develop in that direction has been fought against for a long time, and continues to be fought against in terms of new areas where capitalist relations are advancing and trying to take over. That's also the solidarity between the past and the present.
Yeah, that's what I think it's important politically, and also just from the heart, you might say, that we recognize our own solidarity with those who struggled even before there was capitalism, against capitalism.
And the existence of another logic. a
Yes.
continuing existence of another logic that they are never able to completely destroy.
And at times that we've been using the term commons to bring out this fact that the human capacities for being able to organize collectively for the reproduction of social life is something that is quite crucial to the development of another kind of society. And so I would say that it's a term that I think would be useful, and a concept that I think would be useful for our brothers and sisters, and in fact, beyond that, to the living creatures that we now are increasingly taking part in our understanding of the struggles that take place, that are in fact speak to a generation of militants who are now beginning to put on their banners, "Stop the extinction of species." It's an important change that's taking place.
How you say, the space of solidarity, the extent of solidarity is expanding also. Yes, with the animal world and nature and so on, in ways that certainly was not true or at least not in the traditional conception of the class struggle. So there was a second part which had to do with what you think about the United States now. What are these alternatives that seem to be coming out from a more institutional space?
Well,
Green New Deals and...
yes, most of these are attempts to try to fix the problems of capitalism in a way that would not violate the essentials of a capitalist society. And I know that there are very fine militants who are taking up, let's say, the terminology of a New Deal. But we must remember that the old New Deal was never a victory of the proletariat. I think we have to recognize that. It was not, in fact, it was built to escape the confrontation with revolution and revolutionary transformation. So as a consequence, I would say the Green New Deal, like I'm not sure what color one would put with the FDR form, would put together, if we put them together, we see a particular outcome that is not, if that's what we can do at this point in history, I would say that it was not able. We still are not able, if that's what we have to presumably say is the effort, that we collectively are together forming for the future of human life on the planet, and not only human life, but beyond that. I would like to just point out that a deal U.S. language is an effort to make an agreement that is somewhat suspicious. I have a deal for you means someone is going to give you something that is somewhat questionable.
What is being exchanged? What is that is being exchanged, right, in the deal?
Yeah. So if anyone offers you a deal in New York, you better be careful. See what I mean? And I think it would be, as with most of these kinds of transitional claims and demands and formulations, one must study them and not dismiss people who are involved in material struggles. But at the same time, I think that the terminology of new enclosures in the commons is useful for us to continue our recognition.
Yeah, for instance, what is the Green New Deal? I mean, for example, what are the green? We know that across the Latin American continent there is a tremendous struggle against the, new forms of green energy, the aeolic plants and so on. Presumably all is clean, but actually they require a tremendous amount of electricity and displacement. Like we know in Mexico, for instance, huge amount of struggle against the creation of these territories full of aeolic plants, because they are displacing people, they are destroying animals, they are destroying croplands, and so and same thing with the green gasoline. I know in Brazil, for instance, a lot with the green as in Africa, thousands of hectares of land being expropriated in order to create the green plant elephant grass for the green gasoline. So we have to be very, very careful, particularly when the Green New Deal is supposed to create these new economies that are still capitalist economies. And the question is, who? This has been the history of capitalism, right? That you pacify the struggle, right, by responding to the need of a particular sector of the population. Whereas hidden are others who have been, those who have been displaced by the green gasoline. And it was like the New Deal of the 1930s. Most African Americans workers were not included, in the New Deal. And we're now beginning to see, for instance, I think, which is very interesting, there's work that is being done which is showing that before the New Deal, that legalized the union with the Wagner Act in 1935, there was supposed to be a big union victory because the union were recognized, the whole contract system became part of the institution, and workers were not shot at when they went out to demonstrate. Now it's beginning to recognize that before that, you had forms of labor organization that actually dealt with the whole life of the worker, not only with the workplace defined strictly in terms of the production place, but you had type of organization, labor organization that dealt with health, dealt with pension, work accident, and in that they had very deep roots in the community. And so that division that really begins to accentuate between the workplace, which is the only one recognized, and the community. And more the community falls out of the moment of struggle between workers and capital. So the struggle between workers and capital becomes isolated, becomes in a way refocused, relocalized in the community. And isolated from the in the factories, the places of wage work. Right? That all of that we begin to see that perhaps the New Deal was also a way of undermining that kind of forms of organization, which was very powerful. Because when, factory workers went on strike, the whole community worked with them. The whole community went on strike with them, and organized around that. And then it becomes more and more the contract. The union will negotiate, and they pull out the workers in the street, in the square, for that one day, and it becomes it's like a dance, and and everything is exchanged in equal terms. More money, more productivity, more money, more exploitation, etc. So I think that we have to rethink also of that history and the way the New Deal has been celebrated as a great working class victory, and to see how in fact it has redefined. And for instance, another example, what kind of work have been recognized as work in the new labor legislation. Not only left out, reproductive work in the home, but for instance, the New Deal never recognized domestic work done for wages. Domestic workers who work outside the home were cataloged, classified as companions. In the New Deal, right, domestic work done for wages was not recognized. It's only starting in 2000 and more than 2010. The domestic workers in the United States, according to the labor legislation of a number of states, have been recognized as workers and entitled to some union benefits like a limit on the hours of work, vacation, severance pay. Until then, for all the legislation of the 1930s, they were not recognized as workers. So we have to keep that in mind also, to put the New Deal in perspective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.